The morning mist hung low over Millbrook Heights, Tennessee, on October 13, 1987, when Reverend Samuel Harrison Beck vanished without a trace from Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. For 35 years, his mysterious disappearance haunted the small mountain community, leaving behind unanswered questions and broken hearts. But in 2022, during a routine basement renovation, contractors would discover an old leather-bound Bible containing a handwritten letter that would finally reveal the shocking truth about what happened to the beloved pastor, and expose a web of darkness that had been hidden within the sacred walls of God's house for over 3 decades. Samuel Harrison Beck had always been an early riser, but on that fateful Sunday morning in October 1987, he woke before dawn with an unusual heaviness in his spirit that seemed to settle into his very bones like a deep ache that wouldn't subside. At 42 years old, Pastor Beck was beloved throughout Millbrook Heights for his passionate sermons that could move the hardest hearts to tears, his genuine care for his congregation that led him to visit every sick bed and comfort every grieving family, and his unwavering faith in God's goodness even during life's darkest storms when others might question divine providence. His auburn hair, which had been thick and vibrant in his younger years, had begun to show distinguished streaks of gray at the temples, and his warm brown eyes reflected both the hard-earned wisdom of his 15 years in ministry and the deep compassion that drew people from neighboring counties to seek his counsel during their most difficult moments. As Samuel sat on the edge of his bed in the pre-dawn darkness, staring out the window at the ancient oak trees that surrounded their parsonage, he felt an overwhelming urge to pray, not just his usual morning devotions, but something deeper, more urgent, as if God himself was preparing him for something monumental. The sensation reminded him of the night before he had answered the call to ministry years ago, when he had wrestled with God until dawn like Jacob at the river Jabbok, emerging changed and marked by divine encounter. "Lord," he whispered into the stillness of the early morning, his voice barely audible even to himself, "I feel like you're trying to tell me something. My spirit is so heavy, and I can't shake this feeling that today is going to change everything. Whatever you're preparing me for, give me the strength to face it with courage and grace. Help me to be the man you've called me to be, no matter what the cost." The weight of these words seemed to hang in the air as Samuel dressed quietly in his Sunday suit, a modest navy blue ensemble that Margaret had carefully pressed the night before, as she did every Saturday evening as part of their weekly ritual of preparing for the Lord's Day. His hands trembled slightly as he knotted his tie, and he found himself pausing frequently to pray silently, asking for God's protection over his family and for wisdom to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The parsonage where Samuel lived with his wife, Margaret Elizabeth, and their twin daughters, Sarah Grace and Rebecca Faith, sat nestled among towering oak trees that had witnessed over a century of seasons, their massive trunks standing like silent sentinels just 50 yards from Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. The white clapboard building, with its distinctive green shutters and wraparound porch that Margaret had lovingly decorated with hanging baskets of ferns and colorful flowers, had served the community faithfully since 1923, its tall steeple reaching toward heaven like a beacon of hope piercing through the early morning mist that often shrouded the rural Tennessee mountains. The church bell, cast in bronze and donated by the founding families of Millbrook Heights, had rung out over the valley every Sunday for 6 decades, calling the faithful to worship and marking the significant moments of the community's life with its resonant, holy sound. Samuel made his way quietly through the darkened hallway of their modest home, careful not to wake his sleeping family, and settled into his favorite chair at their kitchen table, a sturdy oak piece that had been Margaret's grandmother's and bore the gentle scars and ring marks of countless family meals and late-night conversations. The kitchen itself was the heart of their home, painted in warm yellow tones that Margaret had chosen because she said they reminded her of sunshine even on the gloomiest days. Mason jars filled with wildflowers from their garden lined the windowsill, and hand-embroidered dishcloths that members of the Church Ladies' Auxiliary had made hung neatly beside the sink. This was where Samuel and Margaret had shared their deepest dreams and their greatest fears, where they had prayed together over major decisions, and where they had celebrated the small victories and mourned the inevitable losses that came with a life devoted to ministry. As Samuel opened his worn leather Bible, a seminary graduation gift from his own father, who had also been a pastor in rural Tennessee, the pages fell naturally to Jeremiah, chapter 1, where he had been studying for the past week. The margins were filled with his careful notes in black ink, and certain verses were underlined in red, marking passages that had spoken particularly deeply to his heart. But this morning, as he read the familiar words about God's call to the young prophet Jeremiah, the passage seemed to take on new meaning and urgency. "Before I formed you in the womb I knew you," he read aloud in a whisper, "before you were born I set you apart, I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." The words seemed to burn themselves into Samuel's consciousness as he realized that God was speaking to him about courage in the face of opposition, about standing for truth even when it seemed impossible, about trusting divine protection when human threats loomed large. He thought about Jeremiah's response to God's call, "Alas, Sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak, I am too young," and how God had reassured the prophet, "Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you." "Samuel, you're up early even for you," Margaret observed as she found her husband sitting at their small kitchen table, his Bible open to the book of Jeremiah, his reading glasses perched on his nose while the first rays of dawn began to filter through the gingham curtains she had sewn by hand during their first year in Millbrook Heights. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton Beck was a woman of quiet strength and understated elegance, with golden blonde hair that she wore in a simple bun secured with her grandmother's antique hairpins, and cornflower blue eyes that sparkled with intelligence, kindness, and an inner light that reflected her deep faith and generous spirit. At 38, she had dedicated her life completely to supporting her husband's ministry while raising their 7-year-old daughters with unwavering love, boundless patience, and the kind of nurturing faith that created a foundation of security and trust that would sustain the girls through whatever challenges life might bring. Margaret had been raised in a pastor's home herself, the daughter of Reverend William Thornton, who had served churches throughout Middle Tennessee for 40 years before his retirement. She understood the unique pressures and sacrifices that came with ministry life, the late-night phone calls for hospital visits, the weight of carrying other people's burdens, the challenge of living in a fishbowl where every word and action was scrutinized by well-meaning but sometimes critical congregation members. But she had also experienced the deep joy that came from serving God's people, the privilege of being present during life's most sacred moments, and the profound satisfaction of seeing lives transformed by the power of the gospel. "I couldn't sleep, darling," Samuel replied, reaching for her hand as she sat down beside him with her own cup of coffee, a morning ritual they had established during their first week of marriage 15 years earlier when they were young seminary students dreaming of serving God together in a small church somewhere in the mountains of Tennessee. "I've been praying about something all night, and I feel like the Lord is preparing me for something significant. I just don't know what yet. There's this weight in my spirit, like God is trying to tell me something important, but I can't quite make out what he's saying." Margaret studied her husband's face with the careful attention of a woman who had loved the same man for 17 years, noting the lines of concern that had been deepening over the past few weeks like worry lines etched by an invisible hand. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers trembled slightly as he traced the verses in his Bible, and the distant look in his eyes that told her he was wrestling with something much deeper than the usual stresses of pastoral ministry. In all their years together, through seminary struggles and financial hardships and the normal challenges of raising children while serving a demanding congregation, she had never seen Samuel look quite this troubled. "Is this about the board meeting again?" she asked gently, pouring cream into her coffee and stirring it slowly while she watched his face for clues about what was really bothering him. "You know, most of the congregation supports the new missions program. Elder Morrison told me just yesterday that he thinks your vision for reaching the mountain communities is exactly what our church needs to grow in faith and purpose." Samuel shook his head slowly, his fingers continuing to trace the verses he had been reading in Jeremiah chapter 1, particularly verse 17 where God tells the prophet, "Get yourself ready. Stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them." The words seemed to leap off the page at him, as if God were speaking directly to his current situation with a clarity that was both comforting and terrifying. "It's more than that, Margaret," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made her lean forward with concern. "I've been sensing something dark in our church, something that goes far beyond disagreements about missions or budget allocations. There are whispers in the hallways, secret meetings that I'm not invited to, people who suddenly stop talking when I walk into a room. I feel like there's a storm coming, and I'm not sure we're prepared for it. But more than that, I feel like God is calling me to stand in the path of that storm, even if it means His voice trailed off as he struggled to find words for the premonition that had been growing stronger each day, a sense that speaking the truth about what he had discovered might cost him everything he held dear. The morning sunlight filtered through their kitchen windows, casting golden patterns across the worn wooden table where the Beck family had shared countless meals and prayer times over their 8 years in Millbrook Heights. This table had witnessed birthday celebrations and Christmas mornings, homework sessions and late-night conversations about the future, moments of joy and seasons of sorrow that had woven their lives together into a tapestry of love and faith and shared purpose. Samuel had come to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church fresh out of seminary at the age of 27, young and eager to serve God in this small mountain community that had immediately captured his heart with its genuine warmth and simple faith. Margaret had embraced her role as pastor's wife with grace and enthusiasm that amazed the older women in the congregation, organizing women's Bible studies that drew participants from 3 counties, coordinating the church's food pantry that fed dozens of struggling families each month, and opening their home to anyone in need of comfort, counsel, or simply a warm meal and a listening ear. The church itself had become like a living, breathing member of their family. Samuel knew every creaking board in the old sanctuary, every stained glass window that painted rainbows across the worn pews on sunny Sunday mornings, every corner and closet and hidden space in the building that had become his second home. He had baptized dozens of new believers in the small baptistry behind the choir loft, married young couples who had grown up in the church, and comforted grieving families as they said goodbye to loved ones who had been pillars of the congregation for generations. "Samuel," Margaret said gently, setting down her coffee cup and reaching across the table to cover his hands with her own, "you've been carrying such a heavy burden lately. Why don't you talk to me about what's really troubling you? We've always faced challenges together, and whatever this is, we can face it together too. You don't have to bear this alone." Samuel closed his Bible and removed his reading glasses, rubbing his tired eyes with the heels of his hands in a gesture that Margaret recognized as a sign of deep exhaustion and stress. When he looked up at her, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, not just concern or worry, but genuine fear for their safety and their future. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as if he were afraid that speaking the words aloud might make them more real, "I've discovered some things about certain members of our church leadership that deeply concern me. Financial irregularities, secret business dealings, and what appears to be deliberate deception of the congregation. I've been praying about how to handle this situation biblically, with love but also with truth, and I feel like God is calling me to confront it directly, no matter what the consequences might be." The color drained from Margaret's face as she absorbed the implications of what her husband was telling her. Grace Fellowship Baptist Church wasn't just their place of ministry, it was their home, their community, their life's work, the place where they had invested their hearts and souls for 8 years. The thought that some of the people they trusted and served alongside could be involved in any kind of corruption was almost too devastating to comprehend. "What kind of irregularities?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Missing funds from the building fund, forged signatures on loan documents, and what looks like systematic embezzlement from the missions offerings," Samuel replied heavily, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "I've been quietly gathering evidence for weeks, hoping I was wrong, praying that there was an innocent explanation for the discrepancies I was noticing. But the more I discover, the more clear it becomes that we're dealing with serious criminal activity, not just poor bookkeeping or honest mistakes, but deliberate theft from God's house and God's people." Margaret's face paled as she absorbed the implications of what her husband was telling her. Grace Fellowship Baptist Church was more than just their place of ministry, it was their home, their community, their life's work. The thought that some of the people they trusted and served alongside could be involved in such corruption was almost too devastating to comprehend. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. "No one yet," Samuel replied. "I wanted to be absolutely certain before I brought these accusations forward. But Margaret, I'm going to have to confront this situation very soon. The congregation deserves to know the truth, and those responsible need to be held accountable." As they sat together in the quiet of their kitchen, neither Samuel nor Margaret could have imagined that this would be their last peaceful morning together, or that within hours, Samuel would pen a letter that would remain hidden for 35 years before finally exposing the truth about what happened on that October day in 1987. The service that morning proceeded normally, with Samuel delivering a powerful sermon on integrity and truth from Proverbs chapter 27, verse 5, "Better is open rebuke than hidden love." The congregation of nearly 200 people listened attentively as their pastor spoke about the importance of confronting sin with love, of choosing difficult truth over comfortable lies, and of trusting God's justice even when human justice seems delayed. "My friends," Samuel said as he concluded his sermon that morning, his voice carrying an unusual intensity that many would later remember, "there comes a time in every believer's life when we must choose between the easy path of silence and the difficult path of speaking truth. I want you to know that I love each one of you enough to always choose truth, no matter what the cost might be." After the service, Samuel spent longer than usual greeting members of the congregation, shaking hands, embracing the elderly, and blessing the children. Margaret noticed that he seemed to be saying goodbye, though she couldn't understand why. Several church members later recalled that Pastor Beck had seemed different that day, more intense, more emotionally present, as if he was trying to memorize every face and every moment. "Pastor Beck," said elderly Mrs. Dorothy Mae Williams as she shook his hand after the service, "your sermon today really spoke to my heart. You seem to be speaking about something very personal and important." Samuel smiled warmly at the 80-year-old woman who had been a faithful member of Grace Fellowship for over 50 years. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to remember that God's truth always prevails, even when it's hidden for a time. Sometimes the things that seem to be endings are actually new beginnings in disguise." His words would prove to be prophetic in ways that no one could have imagined. That afternoon, while Margaret took the twins to visit her sister in nearby Cookville, Samuel retreated to his study in the church building. The small office, lined with theological books and filled with the comfortable furniture donated by church members over the years, had always been Samuel's sanctuary for prayer and sermon preparation. But on this particular afternoon, he sat down at his wooden desk with a different purpose. Taking out a sheet of his personal letterhead, Samuel began to write what would become known as the pastor's last letter, a document that would remain hidden for 35 years before finally exposing the corruption that had driven him to disappear that October evening in 1987. As the sun set behind the Tennessee mountains, Samuel finished his letter, carefully folded it, and placed it inside his most treasured possession, a leather-bound King James Bible that had belonged to his grandfather, Reverend Jonathan Beck, who had also been a pastor in rural Tennessee during the early 1900s. The Bible, worn smooth by decades of faithful study and marked with the spiritual insights of 2 generations of pastors, would become the hiding place for Samuel's final testimony. But where Samuel chose to hide this Bible, and why it would remain undiscovered for over 3 decades, would become part of the mystery that surrounded his disappearance and the dark secrets of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. When Margaret Elizabeth Beck returned from Cookville with Sarah Grace and Rebecca Faith at 8 o'clock that evening, she expected to find Samuel in his study preparing for the upcoming week services. Instead, she found an empty house and an unlocked church building with no sign of her husband anywhere. "Samuel," she called out as she walked through the parsonage, checking each room methodically. "Samuel, where are you?" The twins, sensing their mother's growing anxiety, stayed close to her side as she searched their home and then moved to the church building. Grace Fellowship Baptist Church felt different in the darkness, larger somehow, with shadows that seemed to hold secrets. Margaret turned on every light as she searched the sanctuary, the Sunday school classrooms, the kitchen, and finally Samuel's study. Everything appeared normal, with no signs of struggle or disturbance, but Samuel's car keys and wallet were missing, suggesting he had left voluntarily. By 10 o'clock, Margaret's concern had turned to genuine fear. Samuel was not the type of man to disappear without explanation, especially not when he had responsibilities the next morning. She called the police, and within an hour, Sheriff Thomas Jefferson Crawford and Deputy Victoria Rose Chamberlain were at the parsonage, asking questions and beginning what would become one of the longest unsolved missing persons cases in Tennessee state history. "Mrs. Beck," Sheriff Crawford said as he sat in the family's living room, his notepad balanced on his knee, "I need you to think carefully about your husband's behavior over the past few days. Was he acting differently? Did he seem worried or upset about anything?" Margaret glanced at her daughters, who were sitting quietly on the couch, still wearing their Sunday dresses and trying to understand why strangers were in their house asking questions about their father. "Thomas, you've known Samuel for 8 years. You know he's not the kind of man who would just disappear without telling someone where he was going." Sheriff Crawford nodded gravely. Thomas Jefferson Crawford was a lifelong resident of Millbrook Heights, a man whose family had farmed the same land for 4 generations before he chose law enforcement as his career. At 55, he was known throughout the county for his fairness, his thoroughness, and his genuine care for the people he served. The disappearance of Pastor Samuel Beck would become the most challenging case of his career. "That's exactly why we're taking this seriously," he replied. "But I need to ask these questions, Margaret. Sometimes people who seem most stable on the outside are dealing with pressures we don't know about." Margaret took a deep breath and told the sheriff about the conversation she and Samuel had shared that morning, his concerns about financial irregularities in the church, his sense that something dark was happening within their congregation, and his determination to confront the situation with truth and love. "Did he mention any specific names?" Deputy Chamberlain asked, looking up from her own notepad. Victoria Rose Chamberlain was 32 years old, a former Nashville police officer who had moved to Millbrook Heights 2 years earlier seeking a quieter life. Her analytical mind and attention to detail had already made her an invaluable member of Sheriff Crawford's small department. "No specific names," Margaret replied, "but he did mention that he had been gathering evidence about missing funds and forged documents. He was planning to confront the situation soon, but he wanted to be absolutely certain of his facts first." The initial search for Samuel Beck began immediately and continued for weeks. Sheriff Crawford organized search parties that combed every inch of the surrounding forests and mountains. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist with the case, bringing additional resources and expertise to the search effort. Samuel's car, a dark blue 1984 Ford sedan, was found 3 days later in a remote parking area near Cummins Falls State Park, about 20 miles from Millbrook Heights. The car was unlocked, with no signs of struggle, but Samuel's personal belongings, including his wallet and his grandfather's antique pocket watch, were missing. "The location where we found the car doesn't make sense," Deputy Chamberlain told Sheriff Crawford as they stood in the parking area where Samuel's vehicle had been discovered. "Pastor Beck wasn't the type to go hiking alone, especially not in the evening. And if he was planning to harm himself, why would he drive 20 miles away to do it?" "That's what bothers me too, Victoria," the sheriff replied, studying the surrounding terrain. "This feels staged to me, like someone wanted us to think Samuel had walked into these woods voluntarily. But I've known that man for 8 years, and he would never abandon his family without a word, especially not his daughters." The investigation revealed that Samuel had withdrawn $500 from the church's emergency fund on the Friday before his disappearance, a significant sum in 1987, but one that he had legitimate authority to access as the church's pastor. Several church members reported seeing Samuel at the bank that Friday afternoon, but he had seemed normal and had even stopped to chat with several congregation members about the upcoming fall festival. "Pastor Beck seemed perfectly fine when I saw him at First National on Friday," reported Mrs. Catherine N. Whitmore, the bank teller who had processed Samuel's withdrawal. "He was his usual cheerful self, asking about my mother's health and mentioning how excited he was about the missions presentation planned for next month. There was nothing unusual about his demeanor at all." As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Samuel Beck's disappearance grew cold despite the determined efforts of law enforcement and the continued prayers of the Grace Fellowship Baptist Church congregation. The church board, led by Chairman Harrison Douglas Fairweather, made the difficult decision to hire an interim pastor while continuing to hope for Samuel's return. "We refuse to give up hope that Pastor Beck will come home to us," Harrison announced during a somber church meeting 6 months after the disappearance. "But we also have a responsibility to care for this congregation and continue the ministry that Pastor Beck loved so much." Harrison Douglas Fairweather was a prominent businessman in Millbrook Heights, the owner of Fairweather Construction Company and a founding member of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. At 58 years old, he was known for his generosity to the church and his leadership in community affairs. His appointment as acting church chairman during Samuel's absence seemed natural to most of the congregation, though a few members quietly questioned some of his financial decisions during this difficult period. Margaret Beck and her daughters remained in Millbrook Heights for 2 years after Samuel's disappearance, sustained by the support of the congregation and their faith that God would somehow bring resolution to their nightmare. But as Sarah Grace and Rebecca Faith approached their 10th birthday with no word from their father, Margaret made the heartbreaking decision to move back to her hometown of Knoxville, where her extended family could help her raise the girls and start rebuilding their lives. "I'm not giving up on Samuel," Margaret told Sheriff Crawford on the day she left Millbrook Heights in 1989. "But I have to think about what's best for the girls. They need stability, and I need the support of my family during this impossible time." The congregation of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church held a farewell service for the Beck family that filled the sanctuary to overflowing. Through her tears, Margaret spoke to the church family that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. "Samuel loved this church and this community more than words can express," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Wherever he is, whatever happened to him, I know that his love for all of you remains unchanged. Please remember him not with sadness, but with the joy and faith that he brought to every day of his ministry here." After Margaret and the twins left Millbrook Heights, the mystery of Samuel Beck's disappearance gradually faded from daily conversation, though it never completely left the collective memory of the community. Grace Fellowship Baptist Church continued under a series of interim pastors, and eventually called Reverend Michael Christopher Aldridge as their permanent pastor in 1992. Pastor Aldridge, a gentleman in his 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, served the congregation faithfully for the next 30 years. But he never felt entirely comfortable in the church building, especially in the basement where old records and church supplies were stored. Several times over the years, he mentioned to his wife that he felt a spiritual heaviness in that part of the building, as if something important was waiting to be discovered. "There's something down there, Patricia," he would tell his wife after particularly difficult days. "I can't explain it, but I feel like the building itself is keeping a secret, and someday God is going to reveal what it is." Pastor Aldridge's words would prove to be prophetic in ways he never could have imagined. By 2022, Grace Fellowship Baptist Church had served the Millbrook Heights community for nearly a century, but the old building was showing its age. Water damage from a severe storm the previous winter had affected the basement, necessitating extensive renovations to prevent mold and structural problems. The church board, now led by Chairman Benjamin Taylor Ashford, grandson of one of the church's founding families, approved a comprehensive renovation project that would update the basement storage areas and improve accessibility throughout the building. Ashford Construction Company, owned by Benjamin's cousin Robert James Ashford, was awarded the contract for the renovation work. On a cold February morning, Robert and his crew began the process of clearing out decades of accumulated items from the church basement: old hymnals, Christmas decorations, Sunday school supplies, and countless boxes of church records dating back to the 1920s. "This basement is like a museum," commented Luis Miguel Rodriguez, one of Robert's most experienced workers, as he carefully moved boxes of old photographs and documents. "Some of this stuff has been down here for 50 years or more." The renovation plan called for installing proper moisture barriers and updating the electrical systems throughout the basement. As the workers removed old paneling from the walls, they discovered that the basement had been partially renovated sometime in the late 1980s, with additional storage closets and utility areas that didn't appear on the original building plans. "Robert, you need to see this," called out Angela Marie Washington, the project's supervising contractor, from the far corner of the basement. Angela was known throughout the county for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to uncover hidden problems in old buildings. "There's something strange about this wall section." Robert made his way through the cluttered basement to where Angela was examining a section of paneling that looked different from the rest of the basement walls. The wood was newer, though still aged by 30-plus years, and the construction methods were different from the original basement work. "This whole section was added later," Angela observed, running her hands along the edges of the paneling. "Probably sometime in the 1980s, judging by the materials and construction techniques. But look at this, there's a gap behind this panel, like there's empty space back there." Robert studied the wall section carefully, noting the slight differences in the wood grain and the way the newer paneling didn't quite match the original basement construction. Why would someone add a false wall down here? This doesn't make sense for storage or utilities. Only one way to find out, Angela replied, reaching for her crowbar. Should I open it up? Robert nodded, curious about what previous renovations might have been done to the building. As Angela carefully removed the paneling, a musty smell emerged from the hidden space behind the wall. Using his flashlight, Robert peered into the cavity and immediately saw something that made his heart race. "Angela," he said quietly, his voice filled with excitement and apprehension, "call Pastor Aldrich right now. Tell him he needs to get down here immediately. And call the police too." "What did you find?" she asked, moving closer to look into the hidden space. "A briefcase," Robert replied, his flashlight illuminating a vintage leather briefcase sitting on a makeshift shelf in the hidden cavity. "And what looks like an old Bible. Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide these things down here." Pastor Michael Christopher Aldridge arrived at the church within 15 minutes, accompanied by his wife Patricia and Deacon Chairman Benjamin Taylor Ashford. Sheriff Crawford had retired years earlier, and the current sheriff, Deputy Victoria Rose Chamberlain, now Sheriff Chamberlain, was out of town on training, so it was Deputy Marcus Jonathan Steinberg who responded to the call. "Gentlemen, ladies," Pastor Aldrich said as he surveyed the scene in the basement, "I've been sensing for years that this building was keeping a secret. It appears God has chosen today to reveal what that secret is." Using extreme care, Robert and Angela extracted the briefcase and the Bible from their hiding place. The briefcase was a high-quality leather model, probably from the 1970s or 1980s, with brass latches that had developed a green patina over the years. The Bible was even more intriguing, a thick, leather-bound King James version that looked much older than the briefcase, with gold lettering that had worn thin but was still legible. "Should we open them here?" asked Benjamin Ashford, his voice reflecting the mixture of excitement and nervousness that everyone was feeling. "I think we should wait for Sheriff Chamberlain to return," Deputy Steinberg advised. "If these items are connected to the missing pastor case from the 1980s, we need to handle this as potential evidence in an ongoing investigation." Pastor Aldridge nodded in agreement, but then something caught his eye as he examined the old Bible more closely. "Wait," he said softly, "there's something written on the front cover. It's hard to see in this light, but I think there's a name embossed here." Moving closer to the fluorescent work lights that Angela had set up, Pastor Aldridge read the faded gold lettering on the Bible's cover, "Reverend Jonathan Beck, 1895 to 1978. The silence in the basement was profound as everyone absorbed the implications of what they had just discovered. Jonathan Beck had been Samuel Beck's grandfather, and this Bible had clearly been passed down through generations of the Beck family. "This changes everything," Deputy Steinberg said quietly. "We're not just looking at old church property. We're looking at personal belongings of Pastor Samuel Beck, hidden in a wall that was constructed shortly after his disappearance." Pastor Aldrich felt a spiritual weight settling over the basement as he realized they were standing at the threshold of finally learning the truth about what had happened to his predecessor 35 years earlier. "I think we need to pray before we go any further," he said softly. "If God has preserved these items for 35 years, He has a purpose for revealing them now." The small group joined hands in the basement of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church and prayed for wisdom, for truth, and for peace for all the families who had been affected by Samuel Beck's mysterious disappearance. As Pastor Aldrich spoke his "Amen," none of them could have imagined the shocking revelations that would emerge when Sheriff Chamberlain returned the next day to examine the contents of the briefcase and the old Bible. But it was the handwritten letter tucked inside the pages of Reverend Jonathan Beck's Bible that would finally expose the truth about October 13, 1987, a truth so disturbing that it would shake the foundations of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church and reveal corruption that had been hidden for over 3 decades. The letter, written in Samuel Beck's distinctive handwriting, began with words that still give chills to anyone who reads them today. "If you are reading this, then the evil I discovered has claimed my life, and those responsible believe they have silenced the truth forever. But God sees everything, and His justice may be delayed, but it will never be denied. Sheriff Victoria Rose Chamberlain returned to Millbrook Heights the following evening with a sense of anticipation mixed with dread. The discovery of Samuel Beck's grandfather's Bible and the mysterious briefcase had already been the talk of the small mountain community for 24 hours, and she knew that whatever they contained would either finally provide closure to one of Tennessee's longest unsolved missing persons cases or open new wounds that the community had spent decades trying to heal. The examination took place in the church's main sanctuary, with Pastor Aldridge, Benjamin Ashford, Deputy Steinberg, and the construction crew gathered around a table that had been covered with white cloth to protect the evidence. Sheriff Chamberlain, now 57 years old and one of the most respected law enforcement officers in the region, handled the items with the reverence they deserved. "Before we open anything," she announced to the assembled group, "I want everyone to understand that these items may contain evidence related to a serious crime. What we discover here today may require reopening a case that has been cold for 35 years. She began with the briefcase, carefully opening the brass latches that had protected its contents for over 3 decades. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags to protect them from moisture, were dozens of documents, financial records, bank statements, correspondence, and what appeared to be detailed notes in Samuel Beck's handwriting. "These are church financial records," Sheriff Chamberlain observed as she carefully examined the documents. "But they've been annotated with handwritten notes pointing out discrepancies and irregularities. Pastor Beck was building a case against someone." As she continued through the briefcase contents, a disturbing pattern emerged. The documents showed systematic embezzlement from Grace Fellowship Baptist Church's building fund, missions offerings, and emergency accounts. The theft had been sophisticated, involving forged signatures, altered bank statements, and carefully timed withdrawals that were designed to avoid detection. "Look at this," Deputy Steinberg said, pointing to a series of bank statements that Samuel had marked with red ink. "Someone was stealing from the missions fund, money that was supposed to go to support missionaries overseas. They were literally stealing from God's work." But the most shocking discovery was a carbon copy of a letter that Samuel had written to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, dated October 10, 1987, just 3 days before his disappearance. In the letter, Samuel detailed his findings about the embezzlement and requested an investigation into the financial activities of certain members of the church leadership. He was going to turn them in, Pastor Aldridge said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Samuel had discovered the truth, and he was going to make sure justice was served, regardless of the personal cost. The letter to the TBI included specific allegations against 3 members of the church leadership: Harrison Douglas Fairweather, the church board chairman, Thomas Marshall Henderson, the church treasurer, and surprisingly, Eleanor Catherine Sinclair, the church secretary who had been responsible for maintaining the financial records. But it was the old Bible that contained the most devastating revelation of all. As Sheriff Chamberlain carefully opened the leather-bound volume that had belonged to Samuel's grandfather, she immediately noticed that several pages had been carefully folded around what appeared to be a handwritten letter. The letter was written on Samuel's personal letterhead and dated October 13, 1987, the very day he disappeared. "This is it," Sheriff Chamberlain said softly. "This is Samuel Beck's last letter, the one he wrote on the day he vanished." With trembling hands, she unfolded the letter and began to read aloud the words that would finally reveal the truth about what happened to the beloved pastor of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. "My dearest Margaret, Sarah Grace, and Rebecca Faith. If you are reading this letter, then the evil I discovered in our church has claimed my life, and those I trusted most have chosen to silence the truth rather than face the consequences of their sins. I pray that God will protect you and keep you safe, and that someday, His justice will prevail over the darkness that has invaded our sacred fellowship. For the past 3 months, I have been investigating financial irregularities in our church accounts. What began as minor discrepancies has revealed itself to be a complex scheme of embezzlement and fraud that has stolen tens of thousands of dollars from God's work. The money that our faithful congregation gave to support missions, to help the poor, and to maintain our church building has been systematically stolen by people we trusted to be faithful stewards. Harrison Fairweather, our board chairman, has been the mastermind of this scheme. Using his position as a contractor and his access to church accounts, He has been billing the church for work never performed, inflating costs for legitimate projects, and creating fake invoices for materials and services. Thomas Henderson, our treasurer, has been complicit in this theft, falsifying financial reports and covering the trails of missing funds. Eleanor Sinclair has been altering records and destroying evidence of their crimes. I confronted Harrison with this evidence yesterday evening, October 12, and demanded that he confess to the congregation and make full restitution. His response chilled me to the bone. He told me that I had a choice: I could remain silent and continue serving as pastor while they gradually moved their operation to other churches, or I could find myself facing an unfortunate accident that would silence me permanently. "You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with, Pastor," Harrison told me. "This operation extends far beyond one small church. There are powerful people involved who will not hesitate to eliminate threats to their business." I realized then that what I had uncovered was not just local embezzlement, but part of a larger criminal network that uses churches throughout Tennessee to launder money and fund illegal activities. Harrison made it clear that my investigation had put not only my own life in danger, but also the lives of my precious family. Today, I am meeting with Harrison, Thomas, and Eleanor at the church this evening under the pretense of negotiating a quiet resolution to this crisis. But I fear that they have already decided that I cannot be allowed to live with this knowledge. I am hiding this letter and the evidence in my grandfather's Bible, trusting that God will bring it to light when the time is right. Margaret, my beloved wife, please know that every day of our marriage has been a blessing beyond my ability to express. You have been my partner in ministry, my companion in joy, and my strength in difficult times. Raise our daughters to love God and to stand for truth, no matter what the cost may be. Sarah Grace and Rebecca Faith, my precious girls, you are the lights of my life. When you are old enough to understand this letter, please know that your father chose to stand for what was right, even when it meant great personal sacrifice. Follow Christ with the same courage that he showed when he faced the cross for our salvation. If God permits me to survive this evening, I will destroy this letter and find another way to expose these crimes. But if you are reading these words, then God has chosen to call me home early while preserving the evidence that will ultimately bring justice. I am not afraid to die, because I know that death is not the end for those who trust in Christ. But I am heartbroken at the thought of leaving you, my precious family, and our church family who have been such a source of joy in my life. The evidence of their crimes is in the briefcase hidden with this Bible. Use it to bring justice not only for my death, but for all the missions and ministries that have been robbed by their greed. Let my death serve a purpose in exposing the corruption that has infected not just our church, but churches throughout our region. I love you all with a love that death cannot diminish. Until we meet again in our Father's house, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Your loving husband and father, Samuel Harrison Beck, October 13, 1987. P.S. Margaret, the $500 I withdrew from the emergency fund is in an envelope taped to the inside back cover of this Bible. Use it to take care of yourself and the girls during the difficult days ahead. I love you beyond words. As Sheriff Chamberlain finished reading the letter, silence filled the sanctuary of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. The weight of Samuel Beck's words, preserved for 35 years, settled over everyone present like a heavy blanket of grief and revelation. He knew they were going to kill him, Pastor Aldrich whispered, tears streaming down his face. He spent his last day on earth making sure the truth would eventually be discovered. Benjamin Ashford, whose grandfather had been one of the founding members of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, struggled to process the implications of what they had just learned. Sheriff Chamberlain, my family has been part of this church for 4 generations. If what Pastor Beck wrote is true, then our church was built on a foundation of lies and corruption. The evidence speaks for itself, Sheriff Chamberlain replied, carefully organizing the documents and the letter. We now have motive, means, and opportunity for Samuel Beck's murder, as well as detailed evidence of the financial crimes that led to his death. The investigation that followed would reveal that Harrison Douglas Fairweather had indeed been part of a larger criminal network that had used churches throughout Middle Tennessee to launder money and embezzle funds. After Samuel's disappearance, Fairweather had quickly moved his family to Florida, where he had died in a car accident in 1994. Thomas Marshall Henderson had also left Tennessee shortly after the pastor's disappearance, moving to North Carolina where he had continued his criminal activities until his arrest in 2003 for similar church-related embezzlement. Eleanor Catherine Sinclair was the only one of the three conspirators still alive in 2022, now 87 years old and living in a nursing home in Nashville. When confronted with the evidence from Samuel's briefcase, she broke down and confessed to her role in the scheme, providing details about how Samuel Beck had been murdered and where his body had been buried. "We never meant for anyone to get hurt," Eleanor told investigators through her tears. "We were just supposed to take some money and move on to other churches." But when Pastor Beck started investigating, Harrison said we had to silence him permanently. "They made me help them clean up afterwards, and I've lived with this guilt for 35 years. According to Eleanor's confession, Samuel Beck had been killed in the church basement on the evening of October 13, 1987, during what he believed was going to be a negotiation session. Harrison Fairweather had struck him with a piece of construction equipment, and the three conspirators had then panicked and decided to cover up the crime. Harrison said we had to make it look like Pastor Beck had disappeared voluntarily, Eleanor continued. "They drove his car to the state park and wiped it clean, then came back and buried his body in the woods behind the church. Harrison used his construction equipment to dig the grave deep enough that it would never be found." The following week, search teams located Samuel Beck's remains exactly where Eleanor had indicated, in a remote section of forest about half a mile behind Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. After 35 years, the mystery of the beloved pastor's disappearance had finally been solved, bringing closure to his family and justice for his murder. Margaret Beck, now 73 years old and living in Knoxville with her daughter's families, returned to Millbrook Heights for her husband's proper burial. The funeral service at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church was attended by over 1,000 people, including many who had been touched by Samuel's ministry and by the remarkable faith he had demonstrated even in the face of death. Samuel Beck was a man who chose truth over safety, integrity over comfort, and faithfulness to God over his own life, Pastor Aldridge said during the service. His letter, preserved by God's providence for 35 years, stands as a testament to the power of truth and the ultimate victory of God's justice. As Samuel Beck was finally laid to rest beside his beloved church, his letter continued to inspire people throughout Tennessee and beyond. The story of the pastor who had hidden the truth in his grandfather's Bible became a powerful reminder that God sees everything, that his justice may be delayed but never denied, and that the courage to stand for what is right can have an impact that extends far beyond our own lifetime. The basement of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church was renovated and turned into a memorial room displaying Samuel Beck's grandfather's Bible, the letter that revealed the truth, and testimonies from the hundreds of people whose lives have been changed by this remarkable story of faith, courage, and divine justice. Above the display case containing the Bible, a plaque bears the words that Samuel had underlined in his grandfather's Bible years before his death: "The truth will set you free." Grace Fellowship Baptist Church continues to serve the Millbrook Heights community today, now stronger than ever because of the truth that was finally revealed. And Samuel Beck's letter, preserved by God's faithfulness for 35 years, continues to inspire believers around the world to stand for truth, no matter what the cost may be. The message that still gives chills to everyone who reads it remains as powerful today as it was on that October evening in 1987. Evil may appear to triumph for a season, but God's truth always prevails in the end, and those who choose to stand for righteousness will ultimately be vindicated by the one who sees and knows all things.